I will speak quietly now, not because this story is fragile, but because it was never meant to be heard. There are moments in history where silence is not absence, it is a warning. This is one of them. What you are about to hear does not begin with fire, it begins with a refusal. A single word that never appears in any ledger. A single act that was not recorded, notarized, or punished on paper. No official record explains why the house burned. No court transcript survives. No confession was taken, but the ashes remained, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream. They wrote about rebellions. They wrote about uprisings. They wrote about property lost, crops destroyed, capital wasted. But what they never wrote down was the moment when a woman looked in order and did not move. She did not shout. She did not strike. She did not flee. She simply refused. And 3 nights later, the house burned. The records described the state as orderly, well-managed, productive, quiet. That word appears again and again. Quiet. Quiet fields. Quiet quarters. Quiet labor. A plantation like many others in the late 18th century. Remote enough to escape scrutiny. Profitable enough to matter. The master's name survives. The acreage is measured. The yield is listed with precision. But the woman does not appear. Not in the inventories. Not in the wills. Not in the correspondence. She exists only as a shadow between lines. A presence inferred by the consequences she left behind. Those who knew never spoke again. The order itself is never described. Only its aftermath. That absence is not accidental. Orders were written every day. Orders to move. Orders to carry. Orders to endure. But this one crossed an invisible threshold. Something about it demanded more than obedience. It demanded erasure, and she did not give it. What they never wrote down was that refusal was more dangerous than rebellion. Rebellion could be crushed. Refusal lingered. It unsettled the structure itself. Witness accounts appear years later, fragmented and indirect. A neighbor mentions unease. A priest writes of disturbances of spirit. A traveler notes that the house stood empty long before it burned. No one says her name, but they all describe the same thing. A change in the air. The master became restless. Sleep abandoned him. Orders were repeated, louder each time, as if volume could replace authority. Silence answered him. Not collective silence. Not revolt. One person's silence. That is what frightened him. They say she was tasked with something that night. Something done many times before. The difference was not the act. It was the meaning. She understood something then. Something that cannot be taught, only realized. That compliance had a final cost, and she chose not to pay it. Those who knew never spoke again, because to speak would mean admitting that the system could be broken, without chains being struck, only by standing still. 3 nights passed. The house did not burn immediately. That delay matters. If this were an act of rage, the fire would have come quickly. If it were an accident, there would be explanation. But there was waiting, observation, calculation. What they never wrote down was that fear needs time to ferment. On the first night, nothing happened. The master ordered patrols. Lanterns moved through darkness. Dogs were restless. She did not flee. That alone defied expectation. On the second night, the house remained standing, but the servants were dismissed early. The corridors emptied faster than usual. Someone knew. No official record explains how. The third night arrived without wind. That detail appears twice in later accounts. No wind, as if nature itself refused to interfere. The fire began in a place no one would suspect. Not the kitchen, not the storage rooms. Somewhere intimate, somewhere symbolic. They never specify where, only that it spread slowly, deliberately, as if guided. The master survived. That, too, is important. He watched the house burn. He did not cry out. Those who later described his face said it was not terror they saw. It was recognition, as if he understood, too late, that authority ends a moment obedience is no longer guaranteed. No court questioned the cause. No investigation followed. The ruins were cleared, the estate was sold, and the woman disappeared completely. Not escaped, not punished, erased. Years later, another plantation burned. Different region, different owner. Same delay, 3 nights. Again, no record explains it. Again, a refusal precedes a fire. Again, the woman's name is missing. Patterns like this do not survive in archives. They survive in whispers. What they never wrote down was that refusal spread faster than rebellion because it required no coordination, no weapons, no planning, only recognition. The central rupture of this story is not the fire. It is a realization that the system depended, not on chains, but on belief. The belief that orders would always be obeyed. When that belief cracked, everything built upon it became unstable. The house was only the first thing to fall. There are records of stricter rules afterward. More surveillance, more documentation, an attempt to capture what had slipped through their fingers. But something had changed. Silence became suspicious. Stillness became threatening. Every pause was examined, because somewhere in the past, a woman had stood still, and a house had burned. We do not know what became of her. That absence is deliberate. Stories like this are not preserved. They are buried, because they suggest something unbearable, that the most powerful act was not violence, but refusal. What they never wrote down was how many times it happened, without fire, without witnesses, without consequence anyone could name. Even now, the ruins are unmarked. No plaque, no explanation, just ground where a house once stood. And sometimes, late at night, locals say the silence there feels heavier, as if something unfinished remains. Not anger, not vengeance, awareness. Those who knew never spoke again, because some truths cannot be contained once spoken. They move, they wait, like fire without flame. And somewhere in the dark of history, a refusal still echoes, quiet, unrecorded, unextinguished. The silence after the fire was deliberate, not the kind that comes from shock, not the kind born of grief. This was organized silence. Within weeks, the estate changed hands. Within months, the correspondence stopped. Within a year, even the neighbors pretended the house had never existed. What they never wrote down was how quickly everyone agreed to forget, because forgetting was safer than asking why. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what did not happen. There was no inquiry, no insurance claim, no public accusation of arson. Fires were common. That excuse worked well. But this one disturbed people for reasons they could not name. The fire did not consume the quarters. It did not touch the fields. It did not spread. It ended exactly where it began, as if it had no interest in destruction beyond a single point. That detail appears nowhere officially. It survives only in private letters, crossed out and rewritten. Someone noticed. Someone was afraid to say it plainly. The master left the region soon after, not in disgrace, not pursued. He simply vanished from local memory. Years later, his name appears again in another province, another holding, another attempt at order. The language in his letters changes. He writes more. He commands less, as if he no longer fully trusted words to do what they once did. Those who knew never spoke again, because they understood something had broken inside him. The woman, however, leaves no trace at all. No sale record, no punishment log, no transfer document. She is not listed among the dead. That absence is impossible. In a system obsessed with counting bodies, a missing body is a contradiction, unless someone chose to remove her from account. What they never wrote down was that erasure can be an admission of fear. There are hints. A line in a parish book altered years later, a baptism record missing a signature, a margin note that simply reads, "Do not ask." These are not proof. They are pressure marks, signs that something heavy once rested there. The second refusal happens quietly, not on this estate, not even in the same decade, but the structure is identical. An order is given. A woman does not comply. No shouting, no resistance, just stillness. This time, there is no fire. That detail matters even more, because it means the threat did not require repetition. The knowledge had already moved. Owners begin to complain of something they cannot define. Defiance without defiance. Disobedience without rebellion. Those phrases appear in private journals, never meant for publication. Men trained to control bodies suddenly realize they cannot command intention. And intention was always the true currency. Punishments increase. Rules multiply. But something subtle has shifted. Compliance becomes mechanical. Obedience loses its weight. What they never wrote down was that the system had begun to hollow itself out. At night, some masters dream of fire, not flames. Waiting. 3 nights. Always 3. They wake before it starts. They never speak of these dreams. But the pattern repeats often enough to be noticed by those who listen carefully. This is where the story becomes dangerous, because it suggests the fire was not the cause. It was a message that did not need to be delivered twice. And somewhere, in places not marked on maps, women were learning that refusal could exist, without spectacle, without witnesses, without names. By the early 19th century, records become strangely verbose. Everything is documented, every movement noted, as if writing itself could restore control. But the more they write, the less they seem to understand what is happening. Silence has changed meaning. Stillness has changed meaning. Those who knew never spoke again, because speaking would require admitting that power had limits they could not enforce. And beneath all of it, the original refusal remains untouched by explanation. No motive, no confession, just an absence that refuses to be filled. The house burned, but the order that was refused never stopped echoing, and neither did the possibility that somewhere else, another woman was already standing still, waiting. By the time officials noticed something was wrong, they were already too late, not because of revolt, not because of escape, but because the records no longer match reality. Inventories listed bodies that no longer behaved like property. Logs counted labor that appeared without obedience. Orders were issued, received, and yet something failed to move. What they never wrote down was the moment they realized the system was still standing, but no longer functioning. There's a letter dated several years after the fire, and signed, never sent. It was found folded inside a ledger, as if hidden from itself. It describes a conversation that did not happen. Those words appear exactly like that. Not could not be recalled. Not was misunderstood. Did not happen. The writer insists he spoke. Insists he gave the order clearly. But the response, according to him, was not refusal. It was absence, as if the words had fallen into a space where meaning no longer applied. He writes that this was worse than defiance. Defiance acknowledged authority. This did not. That letter ends abruptly, mid-sentence. No explanation. What they never wrote down was whether the writer stopped because he chose to, or because he could not continue. From this point forward, something shifts in how control is described. Earlier records are confident, declarative. Later ones become anxious. They repeat themselves. They explain too much. That is never a sign of strength. There's a pattern in what disappears next. Not men, not children, women, specifically women associated with interiors, houses, kitchens, private spaces, the places where orders became personal. Their names fade first. Their movements become vague. Their outcomes are unresolved. What they never wrote down was why these absences clustered so closely around moments of refusal. In some accounts, masters begin sleeping away from their own houses, not out of fear of fire, out of something less defined, a sense that walls were no longer loyal, that spaces remembered, that orders, once spoken indoors, could return altered. These thoughts were never shared publicly, but they surface in diaries, encoded as superstition, as if calling it superstition could make it harmless. And then there are the rumors, quiet ones, always beginning the same way. She said nothing. She did not move. She looked at him as if he were already gone. The phrasing varies, but the structure remains. Silence, stillness, recognition. Three elements, always present. No official record explains how these stories traveled. They were not written. They were not announced. They moved through proximity, through shared workspaces, through glances held a second too long. What they never wrote down was that knowledge does not require language. Only example, this is where the story tightens. Because by now, the fire is no longer central. It becomes a reference point, a warning without threat. The real danger is the pause before action, the delay between command and compliance. That space grows, and in that space, authority weakens. Some masters respond by accelerating time. Orders must be obeyed instantly. Any pause is punished. But this only reveals the problem more clearly. Speed cannot restore belief. It only exposes its absence. Those who knew never spoke again, because they sensed something irreversible had begun, not a rebellion, an unraveling, quiet, orderly, almost polite. In later years, when historians attempt to reconstruct this period, they find gaps that cannot be reconciled, contradictions without cause, events without explanation. They attribute this to poor documentation, to decay, to coincidence. What they never consider is that some histories are structured around what must not be said. Somewhere in those missing pages is the continuation of the original refusal, not repeated word for word, but remembered. And memory, once awakened, does not need fire to survive. It only needs someone to stand still, long enough for power to notice that it is no longer obeyed. And when that realization arrives, it does not shout. It waits. 3 nights, always 3. By the fourth decade of the century, the language of control had become defensive, not openly, not in law, but in tone. Orders grew longer. Explanations were added where none had existed before, because explanation is what power uses when it no longer assumes obedience. What they never wrote down was that authority had begun to justify itself. There's a plantation ledger from this period that survives almost intact. Almost. One page has been carefully removed, not torn, not damaged, cut cleanly, as if someone knew exactly what not to leave behind. On the pages before and after, the handwriting tightens. Letters press harder into the paper. The writer was no longer calm. A note in the margin reads, "Delay observed again." No explanation follows. Delay in what? By whom? The absence of detail is the detail, because delay had become a category worth tracking. What they never wrote down was that obedience was no longer immediate, and immediacy was everything. Punishment escalated, but its effect diminished. Whips could correct bodies. They could not correct hesitation. That hesitation spread, not visibly. It moved through timing, through the fraction of a second before motion, through the eyes. Masters began to describe a feeling they could not articulate, that they were being watched while they spoke, as if the act of commanding had become exposed, vulnerable. One journal describes a moment of sudden certainty. The writer recalls giving an order and realizing, before it was refused, that it would not be obeyed, not because the woman could not comply, but because she would not. And he knew it before she moved, before she spoke. That recognition is the true rupture. What they never wrote down was that power collapses first in the mind of the one who holds it. From this point, the fire changes meaning again. It is no longer remembered as destruction. It becomes proof that refusal could cross into consequence, even if that consequence was delayed, even if it arrived silently. Stories surface of houses being abandoned without reason, of masters relocating their sleeping quarters, of doors kept open at night, light kept burning, as if visibility itself offered protection. But visibility only amplified fear, because fear thrives on imagination, and imagination had been given something to work with. Those who knew never spoke again, because to describe what was happening would mean admitting that domination had limits, and limits invite questions. Questions invite collapse. The most unsettling part is this: there is no evidence of coordination, No meetings, no planning, nothing that could be crushed. The refusals are isolated, personal, yet they mirror one another with unsettling precision. Silence, stillness, recognition, always the same. What they never wrote down was how something so small could feel so inevitable. In later correspondence, the fire is referenced indirectly as the incident, as what happened before. Never named. Naming would give it shape. Shape would give it boundaries. And this had none. This is the moment when history tries to close its eyes, because the pattern cannot be explained. Without acknowledging a truth it cannot absorb. That domination survives only while it is believed in. And belief, once withdrawn, leaves no scar. Only absence. Somewhere between orders and obedience, between speech and motion, the system began to hesitate. And hesitation, once learned, is never forgotten. The house burned 3 nights later. But what followed was slower, quieter, more permanent. And it did not need fire at all. The central rupture did not arrive with flame. It arrived with understanding. Not hers, his. There's a moment described in a document that was never meant to survive. A private memorandum, later recopied by another hand, then abandoned. In it, the writer admits something unintentionally. He writes that he felt seen, not observed, not watched, seen, as if the woman standing before him understood something about him that he himself had never been forced to face, that his authority existed only because it was accepted, and acceptance, once withdrawn, could not be commanded back. What they never wrote down was that this realization broke more than the house ever could. From that moment, the story changes direction, because a refusal is no longer an act. It becomes condition, something that lingers even when nothing happens, even when orders are obeyed again, even when silence returns. The pause remains. After the fire, there are no more recorded refusals on that estate. That does not mean they stopped. It means recording them became dangerous, because to write them down would be to admit that the system had failed once and could fail again. What they never wrote down was how fear migrated upward, from the quarters to the house, from the fields to the desk. The master's later letters reveal something else. He begins to anticipate refusal everywhere, in gestures, in silence, in compliance itself. Obedience no longer reassures him. It unsettles him, because he cannot tell whether it is real or merely temporary, as if every yes carries an invisible knot behind it, waiting. 3 nights. This is the point where the system fractures internally, not through resistance, but through doubt. Orders are issued more carefully. Language softens. Threats are implied rather than stated, because explicit force acknowledges vulnerability, and vulnerability had already been exposed. Somewhere else, another house does not burn, and that absence is more unsettling than fire, because it proves the fire was never necessary. Only the knowledge of it, only the memory. What they never wrote down was how memory became a tool more effective than violence. There are men who later describe a feeling of being outpaced by time, as if something had already happened before they realized it had begun. They tighten control. They increase surveillance. They write more rules. But the rules describe a world that no longer exists, a world where obedience was automatic. That world is gone. Those who knew never spoke again, because they sensed that speaking would collapse the illusion completely. And illusions, once shattered, do not rebuild. The woman remains unnamed. That is not an oversight. Names fix things. They allow stories to be contained. This story cannot be contained, because it was never about her alone. It was about what became possible. The moment she stood still. The house burned 3 nights later, but the rupture happened earlier, in silence, in recognition, in the understanding that power, once questioned, does not recover. It only pretends. And somewhere in the dark architecture history, that pretense has been cracking ever since. After the rupture, the world continues as if nothing has changed. That is how these stories survive. Crops are planted. Ledgers are balanced. Ships arrive and depart. On the surface, order remains intact. But underneath, something has been displaced. Not removed, displaced, like a foundation stone shifted just enough to make every step uncertain. What they never wrote down was how normal everything looked. There are fewer fires after this. That, too, matters, because fear does not need repetition. Once the possibility is established, it works silently. Houses are built differently. More exits, wider corridors, not for escape, for reassurance, as if architecture itself could restore control. The language of correspondence becomes cautious. Masters ask rather than order. They test responses before issuing commands. They watch faces, listen for hesitation. Authority becomes performance. That must be maintained continuously. What they never wrote down was how exhausting this became. In some regions, rules are standardized, uniform punishments, uniform expectations, an attempt to eliminate ambiguity. But ambiguity has already entered the system, and once inside, it cannot be expelled. It moves quietly, from one place to another, carried by memory. There is an account from a traveling overseer who notes something he cannot explain. He writes that the women no longer avert their eyes immediately, not openly defiant, just slower, a fraction of a second, enough to be noticed, enough to be unsettling. What they never wrote down was that this pause felt heavier than open resistance. This is how the story spreads, not through words, through timing, through shared understanding, through the knowledge that stillness could be louder than action. The system responds by accelerating everything else. Work begins earlier, ends later. Silence is discouraged. Movement is constant because stillness has become suspect. But constant motion only highlights the moments when it stops. Those who knew never spoke again, because the danger no longer required explanation. It was visible in the eyes, in the pauses, in the way orders hung in the air, just a moment longer than before. Years later, when abolition is debated elsewhere, these estates appear unchanged, stable, orderly. No historian would suspect instability here. What they never wrote down was that the collapse had already begun. It simply did not look like collapse. The woman's refusal becomes something else entirely. Not an event, a reference, an unspoken boundary, a reminder that obedience was not natural. It was taught, and anything taught can be unlearned. The house burned 3 nights later. But by now, fire is no longer the threat. The threat is memory. And memory does not need witnesses. It only needs time. And time, once given space, does not hurry. It waits. By the time the next generation inherits these estates, the fire has become legend, not a story told aloud, a distortion, something mentioned indirectly, like a bad season or a sickness no one names. Young masters are warned without being warned. They are told to be firm, to be decisive, but also to be careful. That contradiction is never resolved. What they never wrote down was that caution had replaced certainty. There's a letter from a son to his father, written decades later. He asks a question that should not be asked. He writes, "What happens if she does not move?" The father never replies. That silence is an answer, because the question itself acknowledges possibility. And possibility is the enemy of absolute control. Around this time, punishments become less theatrical, less public, not because of mercy, because spectacle draws attention, and attention invites thought. Thought leads to recognition. Recognition leads to refusal. The chain is fragile. They begin to understand this too late. What replaces spectacle is procedure, rules layered on rules, forms, schedules, inspections, as if bureaucracy could smother awareness. But procedure only delays realization. It cannot erase it. What they never wrote down was that order had become hollow. There are reports of women being transferred suddenly. No reason given. No destination listed. Just absence. As if removing the possibility of refusal required removing those most likely to embody it. But absence speaks, especially repeated absence. In oral memory, A different version survives. Not of fire, of waiting. 3 nights, always 3. No one remembers why, but everyone remembers the number. Numbers are harder to erase than names. Those who knew never spoke again, because by now, the knowledge no longer needed articulation. It had entered behavior, entered posture, entered the way orders were phrased, and the way they were received. At some point, the fire stops being remembered as an act of destruction. It becomes a marker, before and after, before obedience was assumed, after it had been negotiated, even if no one admitted that negotiation was happening. This is a part history avoids, because it does not fit the pattern of uprisings and laws. It is too quiet, too internal, too difficult to document. What they never wrote down was that the most dangerous changes leave no trace. The woman remains unnamed to the end, not because she was forgotten, but because naming her would suggest there was only one. And that is the illusion that kept the system alive, that refusal was rare, that it was isolated, that it could be extinguished like fire. But refusal does not burn out. It waits, it watches, it remembers, and long after the house is gone, long after the ashes are scattered, the pause remains, between command and motion, between power and belief, unspoken, unfinished, still waiting. By the end of the century, the archives become deceptive, not empty, excessive. Paper multiplies, every action documented, every movement justified, as if writing itself could overwrite memory. But the more complete the records appear, the less they explain. What they never wrote down was why nothing felt secure anymore. Inspectors report compliance everywhere. Work continues. Orders are followed. On paper, the system looks perfected. Yet, private correspondence tells another story. Men describe a sensation they struggle to name. That obedience has become performative. That it exists only while observed. That something retreats the moment attention turns away. There are fewer punishments now. Not because discipline has succeeded, because punishment no longer guarantees submission. It produces outcomes that look correct, but feel unstable, like a structure held together by tension alone. What they never wrote down was that fear had changed sides. In some houses, orders are replaced with incentives, small permissions, minor privileges, a negotiation disguised as generosity. This is never acknowledged publicly, because negotiation implies equality, and equality cannot be spoken, but it can be practiced quietly. The fire is mentioned one last time in a private notebook. The writer is old, his hand unsteady. He refers to it only as that night. He writes that everything afterward felt provisional, as if the world continued, but without certainty that it would obey tomorrow. What they never wrote down was that certainty is the first casualty of refusal. By now, no one remembers the woman's face, but they remember the effect, the pause, the hesitation, the awareness that commands are not laws of nature. They require belief, and belief can fail. This is why the story was buried, not because it was violent, but because it was precise. It demonstrated the exact point. Where domination depends on consent, it pretends not to need. That is unforgivable knowledge. Those who knew never spoke again, because by now, silence had done its work. The system still stood, but everyone inside it felt the fracture. They adjusted, they adapted, they pretended nothing had changed. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of paper and procedure, the original refusal remained intact, untouched, waiting, not for fire, not for rebellion, just for the moment when another order would be given, and another woman would understand that she did not have to move, not immediately, not ever. And in that understanding, history pauses, quietly, as it did before. 3 nights. By the time emancipation begins to appear in distant conversations, the estates closest to the story barely react, not because they are confident, because they are already living with something worse than change, uncertainty. What they never wrote down was that freedom did not arrive as a shock here. It arrived as confirmation. When laws shift, these houses do not collapse overnight. They adjust. They renegotiate. They rename relationships without altering structures, because practice had already separated from belief long before. Obedience had become conditional years earlier, not because of legislation, but because of memory. There are accounts of masters who seem unsurprised, as if they had been expecting this outcome, as if they understood, quietly, that something fundamental had been withdrawn long ago. Not labor, not presence, consent. What they never wrote down was that once consent disappears, power survives only by habit, and habits decay. The fire is no longer mentioned at all. It has done its work. To recall it now would be redundant. The system no longer depends on fear of consequence. It depends on inertia. And inertia is weak. In the years that follow, historians search for turning points. They mark dates. They cite decrees. They look for moments when everything changed. They do not look for pauses. They do not look for silence. They do not look for a woman standing still. What they never wrote down was that the most decisive moment left no trace. There are descendants who inherit land without understanding it. They know the boundaries. They know the yields. But they sense something unresolved, as if the ground remembers more than they do, as if the houses were built on a hesitation that never resolved itself. Some refuse to sleep in the old rooms. They say it feels wrong, too quiet, not peaceful, expectant, as if something is still waiting to see whether orders will be given again. Those who knew never spoke again, because by now, speaking would change nothing. The knowledge had already outlived them. It had embedded itself in posture, in custom, in the way authority was no longer assumed. This is how the story ends in the records, not with justice, not with acknowledgement, but with continuity. A continuity that feels incomplete, as if an answer was never provided. The woman remains unnamed, not erased, uncontained. She exists not as a person in the archive, but as a rupture in expectation, a moment when power was revealed, to depend on something it could not command. The house burned 3 nights later, but the real fire never touched wood. It burned in certainty. And certainty, once burned, does not rebuild. It leaves ash you cannot see, silence you cannot fill, and a pause that history still does not know how to cross. That pause remains, quiet, unfinished, waiting. Long after the last ledger is closed, long after the last name is copied and recopied, the pause remains the most faithful witness, not preserved in ink, not carved into stone, held, carried, felt. What they never wrote down was that some events do not end when conditions change. They end when meaning does. There are places where the ground seems indifferent, fields that yield without memory, roads that forget every footstep. This was not one of them. People who came later described a discomfort they could not justify, a sense that speaking too loudly felt inappropriate, as if the land itself had learned restraint, as if something had once been said here that could not be taken back. Old workers told children not to linger near the ruins, not with fear, with respect. They did not explain why. Explanation would have required language, for something they had learned without words. What they never wrote down was how knowledge survives without instruction. Even after emancipation, habits persist. Commands soften, but they do not disappear. Expectations linger. And yet, something is different. There is space now, a space where hesitation once lived, a space that was carved out by refusal. No one could fully erase. In later decades, fires occur for ordinary reasons. Lightning, neglect. They are investigated, explained. None of them feel like the first, because the first was never about destruction. It was about timing, about delay, about the realization that obedience was not inevitable. This is where the story resists closure, because there is no final act, no moment when everything resolves, only continuation, quietly altered. What they never wrote down was that history often moves forward, without correcting itself. It simply carries its fractures along. Those who knew never spoke again, because by now the silence had become the message. To speak would be redundant. To explain would diminish it. The refusal had already done what words could not. The woman remains unnamed to the end, not because her identity was unimportant, but because her meaning was larger than identity. She represents the moment when a command met stillness and failed. That moment does not belong to one person. It belongs to history's blind spot. The house burned 3 nights later. That detail survives because numbers endure. But what followed cannot be numbered. A shift, a fracture, a quiet understanding that power, once exposed, never feels the same again. And if the story unsettles you, if it feels incomplete, that is because it is. It was never meant to end. It was meant to linger, like the pause before movement, like the silence after an order, like something waiting in the dark, not for fire, not for justice, but for recognition. And once recognized, it does not leave. It simply stands still. What remains after everything else is removed is not evidence. It is atmosphere. That is why the story survives where documents fail. Because atmosphere cannot be archived, only felt. What they never wrote down was that some histories do not belong to paper. They belong to places. Visitors who came much later described the same sensation. A hesitation before stepping forward. A sense that the space required acknowledgement, not reverence, not fear, awareness, as if something had once happened here that asked to be remembered without being named. No marker explains the ruins. No inscription tells you what to think. That absence is honest, because any explanation would lie. It would reduce the story to an event, when it was never just an event. It was a moment when an order failed, and nothing rushed to replace it. What they never wrote down was that systems fear pauses more than rebellion. Rebellion can be opposed. Pause authority must confront itself. And not all structures survive that confrontation. Some descendants claim the story is exaggerated, that houses burned often, that silence is coincidence. They are not wrong, but they are incomplete, because coincidence does not repeat with such precision. 3 nights, always 3, not because of ritual, but because time was given room to work. The woman remains unnamed, and now you understand why. To name her would suggest the story is finished, that it belongs to the past. It does not. It belongs to the moment, when power expects movement and receives none. Those who knew never spoke again, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They understood that some truths lose their force when spoken aloud. Silence preserved this one. If you are waiting for resolution, you will not find it here. There is no lesson written in fire, no justice delivered on schedule, only an understanding that arrived quietly and never fully left. The house burned 3 nights later. That fact survives because it is simple, because it is undeniable. But the refusal that came before it and the pause that followed still resist containment. And somewhere in the unrecorded margins of history, that pause remains between command and compliance, between power and belief, not loud enough to announce itself, not violent enough to be condemned, just present, waiting, as it always has. 3 nights, and then silence. Nothing more is written after that, not because the story concluded, but because writing could not follow what came next. The records end where certainty ends. What they never wrote down was that some moments do not resolve into outcomes. They dissolve into atmosphere. The ruins remain for a while. Then they are cleared, stones reused, would repurposed, as if dismantling the structure could dismantle the memory. It does not. Memory is not housed in walls. It is housed in pauses. Generations later, no one can point to the exact place. They gesture vaguely, somewhere near the old path, somewhere past the trees. Uncertainty has replaced location, but uncertainty is precise in its own way. It tells you where not to stand. What survives is not the fire. It is the waiting. 3 nights. Time enough for certainty to fail. Time enough for power to recognize itself as fragile. Time enough for silence to do its work. Those who knew never spoke again, because nothing could be added. Explanation would only shrink what happened, and this story resists shrinking. The woman remains unnamed, not hidden, unfinished. She exists as a question history cannot close. What happens when an order is refused, and nothing rushes to correct it? What happens when power waits, and the world does not respond as expected? There is no answer in the archive, no verdict, no resolution, only a recognition that arrives too late to be useful and too early to be forgotten. The house burned 3 nights later. That is the last fact anyone dares to repeat. Everything else is implication, silence, ash without flame. And now, even that silence is thinning, not disappearing, just waiting to be noticed again. Between command and movement, between certainty and doubt, if you listen carefully, you can still hear it. Not a voice, holding, unresolved, as if history itself is still waiting to see whether the order will be obeyed